Good morning, Professor Hoffman.
Good morning.
It's great to see you today. Professor, you've got years of experience. You've served in 38 countries doing psychological operations and serving with civilian human intelligence officer, and you've seen amazing things. I'd like to ask you, what do you think is going on today? I mean, what do you think the situation is really like now in Russia? And from your knowledge of Putin, his time in Germany, what do you see? What do you see going on today?
One thing I see is talk about Putin in Germany. Putin. Here's an interesting thing about Vladimir Putin. A lot of the stories that people have heard about him, for example, what he did in Dresden and what he did as a child growing up in a rat-infested apartment building in then Leningrad. These are all stories that he's told. They are not corroborated by friends. They're not corroborated by any other person. They're part of his attempt to cultivate and create an aura about himself that he wants us to believe. So if you look at what happened to him in Dresden, here's what happened. His story is the East German protesters came to the KGB Residentura in Dresden and tried to rush the building. They had already done this to the Stasi building in East Berlin. And he held them off with a pistol and told them, I have the ability to defend the building with my pistol if I need to. That's his story. Nobody's ever corroborated that, ever. All right? And here's what I can tell you, though. And what we know about Vladimir Putin is he watched as East Germans who had been watching West German TV realized that they've been lied to by their government. So the East German government had told them how great things were, how awful things were in the West, yet they're illegally watching West German soap operas and TV shows with people living in nice houses, have nice cars, kids are going to nice schools, they're traveling abroad, and the people saying, I'm not buying this anymore. So that was a major factor contributing to the fall of East Germany, which he experienced firsthand. That we do know. So the reason I bring this up is this is why Ukraine is such a threat to Vladimir Putin, because here is a country where people, even if they don't speak Russian as a primary language, there are a lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine who in a few years are going to be living a much higher standard of living in a freer society than they are in Russia. And Putin knows this, and he's terrified of this because he's experienced this firsthand.
So that's super interesting. Now, when you see the power that propaganda has, or Putin does appreciate that the media has a role in persuading his population of what he wants them to believe. Do you think that the Russian army believes what's being told to them now, or do you think they realize it's smoke and mirrors and the situation's different inside Ukraine?
Well, look at it this way. And this is why I have a very different opinion than some of the folks that I see on social media about what I think the outcome of the war is going to be. I think that the Russian military right now has demonstrated that not only are they they're not even the second best power, second best military in Ukraine, let alone in the world, because the thing is they're not properly led, they're not properly equipped, properly maintained, properly supported. They've got drunken commanders. I mean, I'm not just making this stuff up. This is stuff you see in Russian Telegram sites, right? People that are military bloggers talking about this. You've got videos of Russians that are conscripts that are sent into battle with no training, no equipment, no leadership they can see. This is a horrible state of affairs. I'm saying this as a former military guy who served overseas, and I can tell you right now, the main battle space in this conflict is between the ears. It's what do you think? Do you think you're right? Do you think you can win? Do you think that you're, one team, one fight? Okay, and I don't think the Russians believe that, and they've got good reason not to believe that. What one thing can you point to that the Russians are in some way superior to Ukraine? The Ukrainian forces, they're fighting for their homes, they're fighting for their families, they're fighting for their lives. It's an existential battle. They're highly motivated and they're getting Western equipment, maybe not enough of it, but they're getting some Western equipment, and the Russians are really, with a huge winter offensive. What did they get? They didn't even capture Bakhmut. That's why I'm very optimistic about Ukraine's prospects, because I think the Russian military is not properly motivated and their morale is about as low as it gets.
So if the Russian military is not receiving accurate information and it's really a mess there, do you think that Vladimir Putin himself gets the truth? Does he really get good intelligence reports?
I don't believe so. And I think that there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, there are advantages to being an autocracy. If you want to do information operations, it's really easy to get your key people together and say, here's what our messaging is going to be, here's what the story is going to be, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this. So in that respect, it's easier to be in an autocracy than to be in a democracy. And we have a hard time with information operations in a democracy because we're like herding cats, right? But here's the downside of being in an autocracy, especially when you're led by somebody like Putin, okay? He doesn't want to hear the truth, right? Or he doesn't respond well to the truth. And people figured out a long time ago, you're better off deceiving the boss and telling him what he wants to hear than telling him the truth, especially if you're standing next to a window. It's not really, a good idea. So that's one problem. And another problem is the unbelievable corruption in Russia. I mean, don't get me wrong. Every country's got some corruption, right? It's not a binary thing. It's on a spectrum, right? So you've got maybe Finland on the one hand, on one end of the spectrum, and, the U.S. is kind of closer to Finland, and all the way then the other end of the spectrum, you got countries like Russia, where corruption is it's just part of life. You get pulled over by a cop, and you gotta give him his lunch money to get away. So corruption is endemic, and you combine those two things, and what possible incentive do people have to go in and say, "Hey, boss, we paid all this money to have tanks maintained in this warehouse, but the guy who maintains the warehouse, he stole the money. He didn't spend the money on maintaining the tanks, and therefore, the tanks aren't running. Sorry about that." So I think those are the two biggest problems that Vladimir Putin has right now: is getting lied to for, reasons of self-preservation by the folks under him, and also he's in a fabulously corrupt system where people in the SVR and the GRU told him what he wanted to hear about what's going to happen if we march into Ukraine.
So, I mean, when you look at the situation, it looks pretty bad for Putin. What's the future of Russia, though? I mean, how's he's going to survive this? What happens next?
Well, I'm older than dirt. I've been around a while. I've seen a few things. I remember a lot from those days. And one of the things I remember is how people laughed when CIA predicted the fall and the collapse of post-Tito Yugoslavia. And they also predicted that the Soviet Union was basically, the analogy I always make is like the guy in high school who goes to the gym and all he does is bench press, right? He doesn't do anything else or any other part of his body. And so the guy with the skinny legs goes to the beach, right, with the big puffed out chest because all he does is bench press. He's one-dimensional. And the former Soviet Union was one-dimensional. They had an economy the size of Portugal's, come on. And they're trying to maintain this massive military, and it just wasn't working. So what's funny is the truth is the truth until it's not the truth. And if you look at cases like Ceausescu in Romania, right? He was a guy who had an ironclad dictatorship. He ran that place for decades. People lived in fear. And then December 1989, not anymore. And it was like from 1 minute to the next, he was gone. And that's the problem in Russia is autocracies do a great job of keeping a lid on things until that lid just blows off. That's why I think it is conceivable that Russia, as we know it today, may not be in the same shape in a year or two.
And how does China see this? I mean, how does this figure into the equation for Russia's future?
Well, it's interesting. I used to be a defense attaché. I spent some time in European capitals, but I was also certified for China. I speak Chinese. I have a master's degree in Asian studies. And I've followed China for years. And I'm here to tell you, China and Russia today is not like the Sino-Soviet alliance of 1959. And I use that year for a very specific reason. Because the Chinese have a very long culture and a very long history. They've been around 5,000 years. Okay, they'll tell you that. And every Chinese school kid, without exception, and every Chinese adult knows that unequal treaties forced on them by the czars led to the loss of places like Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, and the Chinese are just biding their time because if Russia falls apart, I guarantee, I will bet my salary on it, that the Chinese would make a move in regaining those territories.
And so what's your projection for the rest of the war? Who do you think is going to win?
Well, there's no doubt in my mind. It's just a matter of when. I think Ukraine is going to win. Ukraine has got the motivation. It's got as I said before, for them, it's an existential struggle. There's not an option for Ukrainians to fight. Russians, on the other hand, they were lied to. All of the litany of problems that the Russian military has. Not only do I say that Ukraine's going to win, I think if the Ukrainians make a concerted effort and penetrate the Russian front lines with force and vigor in certain places, that line's going to collapse and the Russians are going to head for the hills. And if you look at Russian history, there's examples where Russians fought like tooth and nail, but there's also a lot of examples where they didn't. And for the cognitive reasons that I talked about earlier, because if you don't believe in what you're doing, if you don't believe you're properly led, if you don't believe that the guy next to you is going to pull you out of the foxhole if you're wounded, you're not going to throw your life into the battle with your full heart.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor. It was a great interview.
My pleasure. Thank you.